Hello to all dear Manhwa fans. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Before we begin, I want to send a very special shout out to those who left comments on the previous video. Big hugs to our loyal followers. I also want to take this moment to let you know that a new circle video is out for channel members. Lastly, a special greeting goes to Dark Gamer 3492, who once again managed to leave the first comment on the second to last video. You're the fastest. Thank you so much. And now, without further ado, let's dive into this incredible recap. A young man asks his companion how much time has passed, commenting that nothing seems to have changed. Is this something negative or positive? While opening an album from his school days, he wonders if, for those who wish to look younger, this would be a relief, or if his past had been happy, perhaps he would feel differently. As he examines the album's pages, he concludes that for those who want to leave their past behind and transform, this could be something negative. Without much thought, he decides to rip out the album's pages. As for our protagonist, a boy thanks him deeply, saying he's his lifesaver and will never forget him. Our protagonist, dejected, responds that he only hopes he ensures to pay him back soon. The young man, with a broad smile, insists that he's a good person and hasn't changed at all. Junhee, whose name we now know, finds it hard to believe those words. Even his companion, with a somewhat innocent tone, tells him that if he were a woman, he would have dated him because of how good he is. This comment, although intended to be friendly, hints that Junhee has a personality that's too docile, someone who doesn't know how to say no. His kindness makes him an easy target. Later, as they say goodbye on the street, Junhee takes a different path, lamenting lending money, especially because he couldn't even go to the doctor for his cold. Worried about the bill, he thinks he urgently needs to find a part-time job. While complaining about the pain in his throat, the subway doors open, and Junhee remains lost in thought, feeling the weight of having spent all his money. I need to try harder, he reflects, aware that he doesn't have a single cent left. Among the crowd, he wonders why there are so many people that day. Did something happen? He reaches into his pocket looking for something he might have bought, worried about how much harder it will be to get by if the situation worsens. Suddenly, a shove takes him by surprise. Someone tries to push through to get off at the next stop, Sindorim. Junhee is pressed against the glass, stumbling from the impact. At that moment, his gaze falls on a bright advertisement on the subway wall, lodging and part-time work for 300,000 a day. That's a lot of money. The offer seems too good to be true, which makes him think that due to the high pay, it might be something unconventional or experimental. Just then, he realizes he's almost on top of a young woman, who was also pushed against the door by the shove. Annoyed, the girl demands that he remove his hand from her hair, saying it's hurting her. Although Junhee apologizes and explains that the shove put him in that position, the young woman doesn't seem interested in listening. With an irritated tone, she orders him to move away immediately. The subway doors open, but the young woman doesn't relent in her complaint, accusing him of grabbing her hair intentionally and even calling him a pervert. Junhee tries to explain himself, but he can't calm her down. The girl grabs him by the shirt, demanding that he get off with her. Junhee, somewhat dazed, observes her more closely, and as he looks toward the door, he notices another ad similar to the previous one. However, in this case, small print clarifies that the job is exclusively for women. After the incident, Junhee ends up on the station floor, disoriented, while the young woman continues scolding him for staring at her. From the ground, he laments his situation. It seems that all part-time jobs are reserved for women. Meanwhile, she keeps yelling at him, calling him a monster. As she gets up and walks toward the exit, Junhee can't believe what just happened. He was kicked out of the subway just for being a man and being mistaken as a pervert. Dazed, he enters the bathroom to wash his face and calm down. At that moment, a thought crosses his mind. I wish I were a woman. A few days later, we find Junhee on the subway again, though something has changed about him. This time, he's dressed as a woman, determined to get the job he so desperately needs. Before leaving home, his sister had scolded him for going through her clothes, to which he awkwardly explained he had a good reason for doing so. Now at Jez Station, he knows there's no turning back. The subway doors open, and Junhee heads to the workplace. He had never heard of this station before, which only increases his nerves. Upon arrival, he realizes he's not alone. Several people are also waiting for their turn for the interview. As he enters the building, a sense of unease washes over him. The place is cold, and the atmosphere feels overly serious. His phone suddenly vibrates, and upon checking, he sees a message instructing him to go to room 19. It also warns him to surrender all electronic devices before entering. Otherwise, he will be disqualified. Feeling more uncomfortable than ever, Junhee wonders what kind of place this is. Everything feels strange, as if he's about to take an entrance exam. He places his phone on a tray and passes through an X-ray scanner. While doing so, he tries to calm himself by thinking that maybe this is related to some kind of medical experiment or confidential test. He searches for room 19, and upon reaching it, he hesitates, unsure if he's in the right place since he can't verify the information without his phone. Nervous, he presses the doorbell and waits. When he finally enters, he finds himself in a completely dark room. Uncertainty overwhelms him, and he can't help but wonder if he's made a mistake. At that moment, a voice comes through the speakers, explaining that sometimes power outages affect the building, but that the lights will return soon. They ask for patience. Junhee takes a deep breath, trying to calm himself while exploring the room in search of a seat. He realizes there are other women there. One of them, particularly nervous, seems to be trembling in the dark. With empathy, Junhee touches her shoulder and tries to comfort her, assuring her that the lights will be back soon and to breathe calmly. The young woman thanks him in a soft voice. However, the others begin to notice his masculine voice and appear surprised. One of them comments that she thought only women were accepted for the trial. Embarrassed, Junhee apologizes immediately, arguing that he simply has a Shanka voice. Then he covers his mouth to try to disguise it further. The women, somewhat confused, apologize for the misunderstanding. One of the participants mentions that Yoongi's voice sounds familiar to her, while the young woman next to her, still visibly uncomfortable, says she needs to leave for the bathroom because she's not feeling well. At that moment, the power returns, and an announcement plays over the speakers, thanking the volunteers for participating in the clinical trials. It's mentioned that throughout the week, they hope for a positive experience among the participants and that leaving the program early will not be possible. As the message continues, the women begin introducing themselves to one another. Junhee remains silent, observing them. Something disturbing catches his attention. All the women in the room seem strangely familiar to him. Soon, Yoongi begins connecting the dots when he recognizes one of the girls, Jo Han, who had been part of his swim team in high school and always wore her hair in a ponytail. Then he identifies Laura, a young German girl who had attended his school for a few months during their second year. Although he was an exchange student, he seemed to be a different age from his classmates. He also recognized Kang Do-yeon, the girl everyone feared because of her intimidating gaze, especially when she wasn't wearing glasses. Finally, there was Daum, who had been a member of the choir and Hannah's best friend. Unlike Hannah, Dasom was outgoing and popular, gathering admirers, including Junhee himself. All of them had been part of his high school. With this revelation, Junhee enthusiastically remarked that it had been a long time since they had seen each other, but the girls looked at him confused, asking who he was. It was then that he realized that, disguised as a woman, none of them recognized him. Nervous about almost being discovered, he quickly apologized, claiming he had mistaken them for someone else, and moved a little away from the group. Meanwhile, the voice over the speakers continued, stating that it might seem familiar to see some known faces, since participants had been grouped based on the information from the forms they had filled out. Junhee recalled the unusual questions on the form he had completed, and began to understand how they had been grouped. As he reflected, the voice continued detailing aspects of the clinical trial. Worry invaded him again. He had to be extremely careful so that no one discovered his deception. He remained seated near the girls while the voice indicated that there were candies on the table that they were required to consume daily. The young women, intrigued, observed the candies as the announcer explained that the dose for the day was already available and it was time to take it. Junhee decided not to eat his immediately, as he still had a cold and thought it would be better to consult the staff first. He held the candy in his hand, doubtful. The voice went on to explain that, according to previous studies, human sensitivity to the stimuli of love peaked at age 18. The candies they held were designed to restore that youthful sensitivity, meaning their joy. The girls, completely astonished, reacted with disbelief to the statement. Some even tried to spit out the candy they had already tasted. Kang Do-yeon, visibly upset, exclaimed that the whole thing was madness. However, the voice tried to reassure them, ensuring that for privacy reasons, there were no cameras in the rooms and that only women had been selected to avoid incidents. Meanwhile, Junhee, with his heart racing, struggled to stay calm. The possibility that the candy might have unexpected effects filled him with anxiety, as did the constant fear of being discovered. Suddenly, the effects of the candy began to show. Some women started feeling warm, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise. The voice asked them to take care of each other. Junhee, meanwhile, was lost in his thoughts, wondering how the girls didn't recognize him, considering they had all attended the same high school. At that moment, one of the women, overwhelmed by the heat, decided to take off her shirt. Another scolded her, accusing her of being indecent, but eventually concluded it didn't matter. After all, they were all women. Junhee, for his part, found himself in a dilemma. turning over the idea of having to spend a week consuming that joy candy and surrounded by women. How would he manage to stay hidden without being discovered? Hannah began feeling overwhelming heat and, worried, asked her friend Dasom if she was okay or if she wanted her to bring cold water. Dasom nodded silently, visibly affected. On the other hand, Junhee, deep in his thoughts, noticed that all the girls around him were experiencing the effects of the candy while he remained unaffected. At that moment, Hannah noticed that Junhee was covering his mouth with some unease. Intrigued, she asked if he had a stomachache. Without going into details, Junhee replied that he needed to go to the bathroom because he wasn't feeling well. However, it was just an excuse. He actually planned to hide there for a while to avoid any compromising situations. When he reached the bathroom, he found it occupied. He remembered that one of the girls had gone in before the lights came back on. Shortly after, that same girl came out. Junhee took the opportunity to ask if she was feeling better. She claimed to be somewhat recovered, though not completely well. That's when Junhee noticed something familiar about her, and suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. It was the same girl he had seen on the subway the day before. For a moment, he feared she might recognize him, but the young woman simply apologized for having occupied the bathroom for so long and quickly walked away. This reassured him. He remembered that he had worn a mask during the subway encounter, which likely prevented her from identifying him. Feeling more relaxed, he entered the bathroom and let out a sigh, his heart pounding in his chest. Despite everything, he tried to calm himself as he relieved himself. Sitting there, he reflected on his options. Should he inform the staff about what was happening and leave the experiment? He thought that perhaps being honest would allow him to leave without any trouble. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the voice of Do-John, who, in the common area, began identifying the other girls. Do-John mentioned Dae-sam, who belonged to the choir club, Hannah from the swim team, and Laura with her characteristic blonde hair and blue eyes. This led the girls to recall the recruitment forms and the strange questions they contained. It seemed that those responses had influenced the decision to group them according to shared backgrounds. However, Do-John remained intrigued by the identity of the girl who had been in the bathroom, creating an air of uncertainty among them. Suddenly, Do-John turned to another girl with orange hair and asked if she had also attended the same school. The girl, somewhat uncomfortable, replied that she had, and explained that she used to sit by the window. That revelation made Hannah remember her face. It was Park Junhee, a classmate who used to bother the girl sitting behind her. Hannah recognized her immediately, especially because of her distinctive eyes. Do-John, somewhat embarrassed, apologized, saying it was difficult for her to remember all her classmates. However, Junhee didn't stay in the conversation for long. He claimed he wasn't feeling well, headed to his room, and closed the door forcefully. Dasom also expressed her desire to rest. Concerned, Hannah asked if she needed help getting to her room, but Dasom insisted that she was fine. In the end, everyone decided it was best to go to sleep since the night had progressed quite a bit. Do-John suggested that they could file their complaints with the administration the next day. Meanwhile, Junhee, hearing that everyone had retired, thought he was finally alone. He took the opportunity to try to leave the bathroom. However, just as he opened the door, he came face to face with Hannah. Although the situation was awkward, Junhee didn't say much. He simply apologized for having spent so much time in the bathroom. When she asked which room was available, Hannah indicated that room number 4 was free. Junhee thanked her for the information and quickly headed to that room, as fatigue was starting to take its toll. Meanwhile, Hannah entered the bathroom, and as she did so, she noticed something strange that caught her attention. For his part, Junhee was already lying in the room. Everything felt surreal, and he couldn't stop wondering what he should do. Without his phone and with no windows in the room, he knew he had no way to communicate with the outside world or with the building staff. He glanced at the medicine they had given him but decided not to touch it. The mere idea of consuming it filled him with dread. The room only had a small television, but Junhee didn't even feel like turning it on. He then thought there might be some kind of switch to contact the staff, though he also considered going out to look for it himself, assuming that the others were already resting. However, as he reflected, a sound from the neighboring room caught his attention. A voice was singing at the top of its lungs. This unsettled him, as he remembered that everyone had consumed the candies, which were probably causing these effects. Suddenly, someone knocked on his door. Surprised, Junhee asked who it was, and a voice replied that they needed to talk to him. It was Hannah, the same girl he had encountered in the bathroom. Junhee asked her to wait a moment and quickly put on his wig, though he wasn't sure he'd adjusted it properly since there were no mirrors in the room. When he opened the door, he asked if everything was okay. Without warning, Hannah grabbed his hair and yanked off the wig. At that moment, she understood why Junhee had seemed so familiar. She recognized him immediately. It was Junhee. Furious, Hannah pushed him into the room and shut the door behind her, demanding an explanation. She questioned what he was doing there, believing that the job was exclusively for women. Junhee tried to explain, but before he could speak, Hannah appeared to be interrupted by intense pain. Confused, Junhee watched as Hannah writhed as if something inside her was tearing her apart. Her expression reflected profound suffering, almost as if her soul were trapped in a storm. At that moment, Junhee realized what was happening. Hannah had also consumed the medicine, which was likely driving her into a state of anxiety and desperation, perhaps even making her feel the need to pray. Hannah, not understanding what was happening to her, was on the verge of collapsing. Junhee rushed to catch her and helped her sit down. Dizzy, she continued to demand an explanation for his presence while settling onto the bed. It was then that Junhee realized he had been discovered, and a wave of embarrassment washed over him. After a moment, Hannah reprimanded him, accusing him of dressing as a woman just to get a part-time job. She called him a coward and said this was taking things too far. Junhee tried to justify himself, explaining that he needed the money. Apparently, she understood, as she asked him to keep everything a secret, recognizing that he had no ill intent. Relieved, Junhee thanked her with a smile. However, she warned him that while she could pretend not to know, she couldn't guarantee how the others would react. At that moment, she began to feel dizzy again. Junhee quickly moved to steady her, but she asked him to let go. Confused, he tried to understand what was happening, and she explained that she had tripped and needed her bag, which was in room number 5. Worried, Junhee rushed out to retrieve it. Meanwhile, Hannah remained in the room, noticing how the effects of the candy were intensifying to the point where she almost felt like singing. Shortly after, Junhee returned with the bag, but Hannah immediately noticed that he had left without his wig, something that could have given him away. He, still bewildered, hadn't realized his mistake. Hannah, in a hurry, asked for the wet wipes from her bag. Understanding what she intended to do, Junhee decided to give her some privacy and turned to leave. However, Hannah warned him that leaving would look very suspicious and asked him to stay, but to simply turn around. While she prepared, she insisted that he shouldn't turn back until she was done. Junhee, still in shock, reflected on how he had ended up in this situation. It was then that he noticed the television reflected what was happening behind him. In the reflection, he could even see the items Hannah was taking out of her bag. Meanwhile, Hannah continued with her task, feeling her thoughts increasingly consumed by religion. Uneasy, Junhee asked why she was breathing that way, and if she was doing it intentionally. She glared at him and told him to stop saying nonsense. She explained she wasn't doing anything on purpose and reminded him that it was all because of the candy. Suddenly, she noticed that he hadn't consumed his. Annoyed, Hannah approached Junhee and, without warning, shoved the candy into his mouth. Surprised, Junhee felt that he had swallowed something, though he wasn't sure if it was the medicine. "Why didn't you take it earlier?" Hannah demanded. "It's not right to cheat." Within seconds, Junhee began to experience strange sensations. The same symptoms that had affected the other women now overwhelmed him, but in his case, the effect was almost instant. Hannah, regretful, watched as he began to lose his bearings, his vision starting to blur. When he looked at her again, he perceived her in a completely different way. She appeared incredibly beautiful to him. For her part, Hannah began to feel dizzy again, unable to stay on her feet. She got up unsteadily, while Junhee, embarrassed, ended up collapsing to the floor. In a faint voice, Hannah told him that it was all the medicine's fault and that there should be no doubt about it. At that moment, Junhee's mind began to wander, his thoughts taking him back to years ago when he was still a student. He remembered the first time he saw Hannah. It was during a summer, on a sunny day, when a young woman in a swimsuit approached him to ask if his name was Junhee. That was the first time they spoke, during the summer vacation just after orientation. In class, the teacher requested silence because the professor was about to enter, but no one paid attention. That day, everyone had returned to school for a special session before continuing their vacation. Junhee was chatting with 2 friends about the idea of meeting up to play video games after so much time apart. However, all he was really interested in was seeing his crush, Da-sam, but he was too shy to approach her. One of his friends asked if he knew the name of the sports complex that had a gym. Junhee, somewhat confused, asked for more details. His friend explained that he'd heard Da-sam often trained there and looked amazing in her swimsuit. Junhee couldn't help but imagine her working out in that swimsuit. Noticing his distraction, his friend teased him, suggesting that he'd probably join the gym just to see her. Junhee, a bit flustered, said that was nonsense and that he'd never do such a thing. However, to his surprise, he ended up proving himself wrong. Shortly after, he went to the reception desk of the sports complex to sign up. They informed him that 2 months cost 100,000 won and that the registration fee was non-refundable. Without thinking too much, he accepted the terms. He headed to the locker room, changed, and put on his swimsuit. At first, he was excited, but when he reached the pool, he realized that no one was there, not his crush nor anyone else. There was only an employee who asked him what he was doing there and why he had decided to sign up. Junhee, confused, tried to explain, but the elderly man interrupted to tell him that the Coquille Sports Center was cheaper, larger, and had better facilities. That's when Junhee discovered that his neighborhood had 2 sports centers. Distraught, he sat at the edge of the pool, lamenting the money he had wasted. But just when it seemed all was lost, a young woman approached him and asked if he was Junhee. That's how he met Hannah. That summer had been especially hot. Both of them sat by the pool, complaining about the unbearable heat. Hannah didn't understand why the pool was open in such weather. Nobody would want to be there. Junhee, for his part, was there because he had already paid the fee, while Hannah was fulfilling her volunteer hours. As part of the swim team, she worked at the complex for a few hours during her summer. She told him she could have stayed home, but Junhee explained that his parents had kicked him out that morning, telling him to make use of the money he had spent. Hannah asked if he was there to sunbathe since he hadn't swum all week. A bit annoyed, Junhee asked her to stop talking and admitted that he didn't know how to swim. Amused, she pushed him from behind, making him fall into the water. Frustrated, Junhee began to flail awkwardly in the pool, asking Hannah to stop laughing and help him. Between giggles, she suggested he stretch out his legs. That's when Junhee realized he could touch the bottom of the pool. It wasn't as deep as he had thought. Hannah explained that it was a local pool designed for children, so it wasn't very deep. She then offered to teach him how to swim. That day, Hannah taught him the basic movements. She asked him to hold her hand, but Junhee, a bit embarrassed, hesitated before taking it. As they practiced, a group of girls passed by the pool, surprised to see it open. When they saw Junhee and Hannah inside, they stopped to watch what was happening. The girls noticed that Hannah was teaching him how to kick. Although Junhee learned something that day, he never swam again after that summer. Returning to the present, back in the room, after a brief kiss between them, Junhee noticed some subtle scents coming from Hannah. Perhaps due to the effects of the medicine, his sense of smell was sharper. He caught the soft fragrance of her hair and a faint trace of chlorine, which evoked memories of those days at the pool. As she got ready for a mass, Junhee asked if she still swam. Hannah replied that she did, mentioning she worked as a swimming instructor in the mornings. Intrigued, he asked if she still smelled like chlorine. Junhee couldn't help but think of her slender figure, shaped by years of training. His mind wandered for a moment, contemplating how each of Hannah's movements reflected the strength and grace of an experienced swimmer. Hannah, however, seemed somewhat uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Noticing her reaction, Junhee continued with the preparations, taking out his chalice, a gesture that made her blush. She, somewhat embarrassed, asked him to stop, remarking that she hadn't imagined a chalice could be so large. At that moment, Junhee took a strand of her hair and brought it close to his nose, inhaling deeply. Hannah, startled and embarrassed, asked him to stop, insisting that swimmers smelled bad because of the chlorine. "You're such a fool," she said, although her tone was more one of discomfort than anger. Despite her words, Junhee continued with a nostalgic smile. "Do you remember how we always played in the pool?" he asked, his gaze filled with memories. Hannah, still a little puzzled, nodded. "Of course," she replied. "That was the last time we talked like that, 3 years ago." As was customary, Junhee went to the pool that summer. During one of those visits, Hannah took his kickboard, leaving Junhee unable to swim without it. Smiling, she told him he wasn't a child anymore while holding it out of his reach. With a playful gesture, she kicked him, making him fall into the water, telling him that if he wanted to use it, he'd have to work harder in practice. During that month, the two shared a routine that brought them very close. Although Junhee wasn't on the swim team, he felt motivated to improve, wondering why he wanted to measure up to Hannah. She, laughing, told him he just needed to practice more of what she had taught him. One day, Hannah decided to go down to the pool to practice, claiming she felt like she was getting rusty. Junhee couldn't help but watch her in silence. Her pale skin, with no trace of a tan, contrasted with the water, and each time she swam, he noticed details that made him feel increasingly drawn to her. Hannah, a bit tired, approached the edge of the pool and commented that it wasn't the same as swimming in a competition pool. Taking the opportunity, Junhee came up behind her and started tickling her. Between laughter, she asked him to stop, but he continued, enjoying the moment. What began as a game turned into a small water fight. Amid splashes and laughter, they ended up staring at each other. It was a strange moment, charged with an unfamiliar tension for both of them. But just as it seemed something might happen, someone entered the pool, breaking the magic of the moment. Hannah, nervous, continued their play fight. Seeing her, the newcomer asked what they were doing there in such heat. Hannah, somewhat surprised, wanted to know what had brought them to the pool. Daesum explained that they had decided to bring her some ice cream after hearing from Junhee that Hannah was doing volunteer work. Junhee seized the moment to comment on how hard that job must be, just for being on the swim team. Hannah, stepping out of the water, reminded them that to enter the pool they needed to take off their shoes. Dasam, trying to lighten the mood, joked that they had only come because they thought Hannah was bored. Junhee, reluctant to get his feet wet, pointed out that there was no one else in the pool and that the dirt would go away soon. However, Hannah insisted there were people, but when she turned to find support from her companion, she noticed there was no one else there. Junhee, feeling uncomfortable, ran off, trying to hide and avoiding even the receptionist. He was embarrassed that Hannah's friends might discover he went to the pool with her every day. From that day on, he stopped attending the center, and shortly afterward, classes resumed. Although they continued to cross paths in the hallways, Junhee decided to ignore her, even though he noticed how she looked at him. In the last summer, on an especially hot day, Junhee passed by the local pool for the first time in years. The place was empty, with the pool completely drained and a no-entry sign hanging at the entrance. Back in the present, Junhee continued tickling Hannah, who, between laughs, tried to stop him by holding onto the chalice. But with his playful attitude, he kept insisting, enjoying the moment. "You can do whatever you want," she said, somewhat surprised by her own response. Junhee, confused, changed the subject. "Did you teach classes this morning? Where's your swimsuit?" Hannah, puzzled by the question, responded that she had stored it in her bag. Then he asked her to put it on. The request caught her off guard, and with a noticeable blush on her cheeks, she thought Junhee was being a pervert. But before she could protest, he, with tears in his eyes, confessed that he just wanted to see her again in her swimsuit. Surprised but moved, Hannah eventually agreed. She took the swimsuit out of her bag and put it on, mumbling that she hated doing it when it was still wet. Once ready, she turned to him with a mix of embarrassment and amusement. "Are you happy now?" Junhee, with a nervous expression, gently took her hand and sat her down beside him. "I lied," he suddenly confessed. Hannah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "My parents forced me to go the first week," he explained. "But after that, I kept going because I really enjoyed swimming with you." Hannah, surprised by his honesty, smiled shyly. "I felt the same way," she admitted. Then, in a playful gesture, she grabbed the chalice and tickled his armpit. Junhee, blushing at her reaction, felt a bit embarrassed but continued. "Sometimes I pretended to step into the water just to spy on you. I wanted to see you up close, talk to you, but I was always too shy. That's why I ignored you in the second semester." As he spoke, he couldn't help but keep playing with the chalice. This time, without warning, Hannah tried to remain composed but began to feel uncomfortable, especially when she was about to fall off the bed. In a quick move, Junhee grabbed her by the swimsuit. "Stop pulling!" she scolded him, but he, ignoring her complaint, continued tickling her. Amid the laughter, Junhee recalled how Hannah used to see herself as a tomboy beside Daesom. However, Junhee had always thought she was the most feminine of them all. That was when Hannah began to understand what was really going on. He just wanted to get her attention. With determination, she took the chalice and began preparing the mass. Junhee, surprised by her reaction, watched in silence. Hannah recited the first prayer, and a little wine began to flow from the chalice. Junhee, worried, told her that in her state, she shouldn't continue, but she firmly replied, "It doesn't matter. The mass must go on, and you can't run away." As they progressed with the prayers, Junhee couldn't stop noticing how it seemed like Hannah's spirit responded to kindness. At one point, he mentioned her name aloud, which surprised her. "That's embarrassing," she murmured, lowering her gaze. Then he looked at her intently. "Now say my name. I won't avoid you just because I'm embarrassed." Hannah looked up, feeling something inside her change. Though she was still confused by her own feelings, she decided to face the moment. She commented that they should have held the mass much earlier. He took her swimsuit, but she scolded him for pulling it. He didn't care. He was determined to do whatever it took to find the path to God. Suddenly, Junhee felt the need to fetch the holy water. She asked him to be careful not to stain her swimsuit, but he paid little attention, and stumbling, ended up spilling all the water on her. Since it was his fault, Hannah insisted that he accompany her to buy a new one later. A while later, the door opened, and she asked if he had finished washing. After prolonging the mass for hours, they both regained their composure. No one else left the room, and what happened during the mass brought them back to their senses. Although for Junhee it was somewhat embarrassing, in the bathroom, he left the toilet seat up. Hannah commented that only a man would do something like that, reminding him to be more careful with those little details that could give him away. Before leaving, Hannah warned him that when he took the candy, he should go straight to his room to avoid the others seeing the chalice. If he couldn't handle the situation, she offered to repeat the mass. Junhee was left puzzled, but at least he knew Hannah was protecting his secret. When Hannah left, Junhee thought about how easy it would be to catch him if he left the door open. Noticing that the lights in other rooms were on, he decided to remain silent. However, a door suddenly slammed open. It was Laura, who had heard everything.